Throughout the 20th century, Russian immigration was present in many countries, including China, countries of Europe and North America, and of course South America as well. In South America, Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, became one of the key centers of Russian immigration. This is just one example illustrating this. It's a collection called Free Thought, Вольная мысль. This is volume 3 of this regularly published collection, which was published in September 1961. This collection included essays about philosophy, history, and literature by prominent Russian thinkers abroad, like Nikolai Lossky, the very famous Russian philosopher, and the priest Alexander Shmeman. The goal of this collection, as its editors imagined it, was to create an ideological alternative to the Soviet Marxism, to show the people in diaspora and inside the Soviet Union that it is possible to think about the world, history, the society in entirely different ways. And the way they approached it is by, again, trying to make sense of history and modern events through turning to philosophy and literature. A typical entry of this volume is the opening article by the philosopher Nikolai Lossky called The Meaning of History, which, despite being about history, starts with metaphysics. He starts with classical German philosophy like Leibniz, and basically starts with creating his overarching philosophical theology, from which he concludes that the meaning of history is for humanity to come closer to God, the deification of humanity. And the practical way in which humanity becomes closer to God for Lossky is through unification of countries in voluntary unions. And specifically, he analyzes historical developments happening in Europe at the time, and he praises these earlier stages of Western European integration that would eventually become the foundation for the European Union, and contrasts them with the Soviet policies and Eastern Europe, where after the World War II, the Soviet Union basically forced countries of the Eastern Bloc into its sphere of influence and maintained its dominance in the Eastern Europe through force and through military interventions. So the first one for Lossky, the voluntary integration of countries into larger and larger political bodies, is the way towards becoming something like unified and, in this sense, manifesting the divine unity on earth, whereas this other integration, the integration by force, is the opposite of that. Now, despite this being a very philosophical work, most of the entries in this volume are actually not about philosophy but about literature. And it makes a lot of sense, because before the 1917 revolution, for a gamut of reasons, academic philosophy had never developed into a strong force in Russian society. Instead, the functions that in other places would be considered those of philosophy, in Russian culture were usually delegated to literature. Hence, the tradition of very philosophical 19th century Russian literature, including figures like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, who are also discussed in this volume, who basically addressed large-scale philosophical, metaphysical, theological questions in their fiction, in their literary works. Now, the authors of this volume use these 19th century writers as a window to understanding modern society and modern historical events. They also discuss modern Russian literature. In particular, there is an entry by Alexander Shmeman about Boris Pasternak, who was basically a dissident Soviet authors living inside the Soviet Union who had died in 1960, a year prior to the publication of this volume. So it makes sense that they wanted to commemorate his life and his literary work by including a long entry about Pasternak in this volume. From the introduction to this text, from the introduction to this volume, we know how the authors and the editors of this collection understood their mission. They really had this idea that the historical mission of Russian immigration is to maintain and develop this alternative view of the universe that people in Russia should learn and incorporate in their life. They really wrote hoping to change Russian culture and society, thinking that such a cultural shift, such a cultural change would eventually lead to social and political changes in Russia. Because it is important to say that they are critical about themselves, about Russian society too, saying that everything that is happening in the Soviet Union is also a result of actions of Soviet people. So if there is a chance that anything would ever change, there should be, first of all, a cultural and ideological transformation, which was the hope of the authors of this volume. And therefore, they address it to people inside the Soviet Union, to Soviet people, to people in the Soviet Russia, saying that the goal of this volume is to awaken the conscience of modern Russians, especially the youth and the intellectuals. And the hope, again, was that as this youth and these intellectuals, absorbing these ideas, became more of an actual power inside the Soviet society, it would lead to cultural and eventually social transformation.